Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
Why does a woman's softness sometimes affect him more than conflict, distance, or even heartbreak ever could? Why can one gentle moment stay in his soul longer than years of intensity? Why does her tenderness sometimes reach places in him that pain never touched? And why is it often not her chasing, not her suffering, not her trying harder, but her softness that becomes the moment everything starts changing inside him? Because true softness is not weakness. It is not passivity. It is not emotional collapse. It is not losing herself to love. True softness is presence without force, truth without aggression, love without control. A kind of feminine energy that does not attack his defenses, but makes those defenses feel unnecessary for one sacred moment. And when that happens, something profound can awaken in him. Not always visibly, not always immediately, but deeply. In this video, we're going to explore why her softness becomes his spiritual turning point, and why what looks gentle on the surface can become one of the most powerful forces in the masculine soul. Chapter 1. Softness is not what most people think it is. When people hear the word softness, they often misunderstand it immediately. They think it means weakness, passivity, fragility, a lack of strength, a lack of boundaries. A woman who bends too easily, gives too much, accepts too little, and disappears inside love. But that is not softness. That is ungrounded surrender. That is self-abandonment. That is pain wearing the costume of gentleness. Real softness is something far more powerful than that. Real softness is strength that no longer needs violence to prove itself. It is tenderness without losing truth. It is openness without losing self. It is receptivity without becoming powerless. It is emotional presence that does not force, chase, dominate, or collapse. And that is exactly why it can affect him so deeply. Because true feminine softness does not come from weakness. It comes from inner steadiness. It comes from a woman who is not at war with herself. A woman who does not need to manipulate the moment. A woman who does not need to control the outcome to remain in her dignity. A woman who can stay open without begging, honest without attacking, loving without disappearing. That kind of softness has spiritual force. Not loud force. Not aggressive force. Quiet force. The kind that enters the room and changes the emotional atmosphere without needing to announce itself. And for many men, especially men who have spent much of their lives inside armor, control, emotional restraint, or silent survival, that kind of softness can become unforgettable. Why? Because it reaches them in a language they are not used to receiving. The world often teaches men how to respond to pressure, to competition, to demand, to conflict, to expectation, to performance, to strength that looks like hardness. But softness is different. Softness does not compete with his defenses. It does not try to conquer them. It does not humiliate them. It does not say, "Open now, prove yourself, explain yourself, become something for me this instant." Instead, it says something much deeper without words. You do not have to fight here. That is what makes softness so spiritually powerful. It creates contact without control. And contact without control can be one of the most disarming experiences in the masculine soul. Because many men know how to resist force. They know how to shut down under pressure. How to become silent when they feel cornered. How to retreat when they feel emotionally demanded. How to hide behind logic, distance, or composure when the moment feels too intense. But softness often reaches where force cannot. Why? Because force activates defense. Softness can make defense feel unnecessary, if only for a moment. And that moment can change everything. Imagine a man who is used to holding himself tightly, used to staying measured, used to not showing too much, used to carrying pressure privately, used to believing that strength means remaining composed, guarded, hard to read. Then he meets a woman whose softness is not weak, but grounded. She is not trying to overpower him. not trying to decode him aggressively, not trying to pull him open before he is ready, not trying to shame his slowness or punish his silence. She is simply present, warm, clear, gentle, rooted in herself. She speaks truth without aggression. She feels deeply without flooding the field. She holds tenderness without making tenderness into neediness. That kind of softness can affect him more deeply than conflict ever could. Because conflict may make him react. Softness makes him feel. And feeling is often far more disruptive than reaction. A man can argue while staying defended. He can withdraw while staying defended. He can perform control while staying defended. But if softness reaches the right place in him, something else happens. He begins to lower. Not necessarily outwardly at first. Inwardly. His nervous system may soften before his words do. His heart may respond before his mind knows how to explain the response. He may feel calmer, quieter, more affected, more inward, more seen in a way that is difficult to name. That is why softness is not small. It is not ornamental. It is not secondary. It is one of the deepest forms of feminine power because it carries a truth the hardened world often forgets. Not everything sacred opens through force. Some things only open through safety. That is the first great truth of this chapter. Softness creates safety. Not false safety. Not permissive self-erasure. Not, I will accept anything just to keep love. Real safety. The kind of safety that comes when a woman is deeply in her own body, deeply in her own truth, and therefore no longer forcing the moment to become something other than what it is. Around that kind of woman, a man may feel something rare. He does not have to perform strength every second in order to remain worthy in the space. And that can touch him deeply. Because many men are loved through performance long before they are loved through truth. They are loved for how steady they seem, how useful they are, how calm they remain, how much they can handle, how little they appear to need, how well they carry things, how convincingly they embody strength. But softness sees past performance. Or rather, it does not fight performance directly. It simply remains so present, so clear, so undistorted that the deeper self beneath performance begins to stir on its own. That is why softness can become a spiritual turning point. It does not just comfort him. It reveals him. It reveals the tenderness beneath the control, the longing beneath the silence, the exhaustion beneath the composure, the humanity beneath the masculine role. And because it reveals him without attacking him, it can reach parts of him that more forceful energies never could. This is where many people get it wrong. They think what transforms a man is pressure, pain, consequences, intensity, loss, conflict. And yes, sometimes those things wake him up. But there are places in the masculine heart that are not awakened by pain first. They are awakened by being met gently enough that the soul recognizes something it has been starving for. That something is not weakness. It is emotional refuge. And refuge can be more confronting than pain. Because pain he may know how to survive. Softness shows him a kind of peace he may not yet know how to hold. That can be overwhelming in its own way. Why? Because when a man feels real feminine softness, not performative sweetness, not wounded overgiving, but real softness, he may begin realizing how defended he has been for a very long time. He may begin feeling the cost of always being braced, the cost of always staying in role, the cost of calling hardness strength, when, underneath it all, there has been a part of him longing for a place to exhale. This is why softness can shake him. Not because it is dramatic, because it is precise. It reaches the hidden places, the places that are tired, the places that are lonely, the places that have not been touched by gentleness without agenda. A single soft moment can stay with him for years for this reason. A calm conversation, a compassionate look, a tender presence, a woman who remains grounded while telling the truth. A woman whose softness does not invade him, but does not disappear either. These things can leave an imprint. Because they do not only say, I care. They say, there is another way of being here. Another way of being masculine. another way of being close, another way of being seen, another way of being strong without staying armored every second. That message can live inside him long after the moment ends. And perhaps that is why softness is often so misunderstood. Because from the outside, it may look passive. But internally, it can create enormous movement. It can make him question what strength really is. Make him notice how much effort his defenses take. Make him feel the gap between who he has been taught to be and who he is when something sacred touches him. Make him realize that gentleness is not the opposite of power. Sometimes gentleness is the only power deep enough to reach the soul. That is the deeper truth of Chapter 1. Softness is not what most people think it is. It is not weakness, passivity, or self-erasure. It is grounded tenderness, emotional truth, and presence without force. It is a feminine power that does not attack his defenses, but makes those defenses feel less necessary. It creates safety where performance can soften, where the nervous system can exhale, and where the deeper self beneath masculine armor can begin to stir. This is why her softness can affect him more than pressure, pain, or conflict. Because softness does not overpower him. It reaches him. And sometimes being reached gently is the beginning of everything. Because in the end, true softness does not make her smaller. It makes truth easier to feel. And for a man who has lived too long behind control, that can become the first sacred doorway back to himself. Chapter 2. Her softness reaches where force cannot. One of the deepest reasons her softness becomes his spiritual turning point is this. It reaches where force cannot. That is the mystery. That is the paradox. And that is why it can affect him more deeply than pressure, pursuit, conflict, heartbreak, or emotional intensity ever did. Because force and softness do not move through the masculine soul in the same way. Force activates defense. Softness can bypass it. This does not mean men never respond to pressure. Of course they do. Pressure can make a man react. Conflict can make him explain. Loss can make him panic. Pain can make him notice. Intensity can make him feel overwhelmed enough to move in some visible way. But reaction is not the same as awakening. And that distinction matters. A man can react while still staying defended. He can respond to pressure while still remaining emotionally armored. He can say the right things, feel guilty, become temporarily expressive, or move from fear for a moment and still not be deeply transformed. Why? Because force often activates the surface self. The self that knows how to manage, how to protect, how to regain control, how to survive the emotional weather without surrendering anything essential. Softness is different. Softness does not usually provoke the same surface reaction. Instead, it can touch the deeper self. The self beneath the role, beneath the control, beneath the masculine image, beneath the carefully constructed ways he has learned to remain safe in connection. And that is why softness can become so spiritually significant. Because it does not merely create reaction. It creates contact. This is what so many people miss. They think stronger force creates stronger transformation. But the masculine heart is often not transformed by what pushes against it hardest. It is transformed by what reaches it honestly enough that the deeper self begins to respond before the defenses can fully organize. That is the power of softness. Imagine a man who is used to intensity, used to conflict, used to pressure, used to emotional demands, direct questioning, disappointment, confrontation. People needing things from him, the world expecting performance from him, life asking him to remain strong no matter what is happening underneath. He may know exactly how to function in those environments. He may become more silent, more logical, more distant, more controlled, more task-oriented, more defended. Because when intensity increases, many men do not melt. They armor harder. That is why force has limits. Force can get his attention, but it often cannot get his soul. Her softness can. Not because softness is manipulative. Not because softness is doing something to him. But because softness creates a different kind of field. A field where he is not being pressed from the outside. A field where he is not being cornered into performance. a field where he does not need to defend the same way. And when a man no longer needs to defend the same way, something very sacred becomes possible. He can feel. That is why her softness reaches where force cannot. Because force often meets the masculine defenses first. Softness can reach beneath them. This does not mean every man immediately opens in the presence of softness. That would be too simplistic. Some men fear softness precisely because of how deeply it reaches them. Some men feel safer in conflict than in tenderness, because conflict still lets them stay armored while tenderness threatens the armor itself. But even when he resists softness, even when he does not know what to do with it, it may still reach him more deeply than pressure ever did. Why? Because softness does not ask him to win. It asks him to be. And being can feel far more vulnerable than performing. A man may know how to handle confrontation. He may not know how to handle being met gently. He may know how to respond when someone is angry. He may not know how to respond when someone is soft without being weak, honest without being harsh, emotionally present without trying to control him. That is often what makes softness feel so intense. It shows him a kind of contact that does not fit the old map. A map where love often came mixed with demand, where closeness came mixed with pressure, where tenderness may have felt conditional, unstable, or dangerous, where being deeply known may have felt like exposure rather than safety. Then he encounters a woman whose softness is rooted, not self-abandoning, not pleading, not collapsing into him, not trying to earn love by becoming smaller, just real, clear, gentle, steady, emotionally alive without becoming chaotic, truthful without becoming hard. That kind of softness can enter him like a shock of peace. And peace can be more disorienting than pain. Because pain he may understand. Pain fits the old map. Softness rewrites it. That is why one soft moment can stay in a man longer than years of intensity. A calm tone. A compassionate look. A woman who tells the truth without attacking. A woman who remains open without demanding that he immediately become different in order to deserve the space. A woman who does not weaponize her sensitivity. These things may seem small, but they can go very deep, because they create a type of contact the masculine nervous system may not often experience. Contact without control. Contact without shame. Contact without force. That is sacred. And sacred things do not always make noise when they enter. Sometimes they enter quietly and then remain. He may not know why he keeps thinking about the moment. Why one small conversation affected him so much. Why one soft interaction lingers in memory longer than all the louder experiences before it. But the reason is often simple. Something in him felt safe enough to be touched. Not fully. Not forever maybe. But enough. And enough is powerful. Because if a man has spent years moving through life with his heart hidden behind function, discipline, composure, and usefulness, then even one moment of softness that reaches the hidden self can create enormous inner movement. That moment may not make him speak immediately. It may not make him suddenly emotionally fluent. It may not instantly dissolve all fear. But it may begin changing the inner atmosphere. Now he knows another kind of contact exists. Now he knows it is possible to be met without being forced. To be seen without being cornered. To be touched without being invaded. To be emotionally reached without first having to fail, collapse, or break open in a dramatic way. That knowledge alone can become a turning point. This is also why softness can feel more powerful than repeated emotional explanations. Not because explanations are wrong, but because a man can argue with words. He can defend against logic, withdraw from conflict, explain away pressure, resist demands. But softness often gives him less to push against. And because there is less to push against, the deeper layers become more reachable. That is why her softness can feel almost disarming. Not disarming in a manipulative sense. Disarming in the sense that something in him lowers before he consciously decides to lower it. His body may relax before his mind trusts the moment. His heart may respond before his story catches up. His hidden tenderness may stir before he knows how to admit it. This is how softness often works. It does not break down the door. It enters through what is already human. This is especially important for understanding the masculine spiritual journey, because many men are not changed most by being told what is wrong with them. They may already know somewhere deep down that they are defended, distant, divided, afraid, emotionally cautious, and unfinished. What they do not know is what happens when they are met in a way that does not deepen their shame. Softness can offer that. It says without words, there is another way. You do not have to be dragged into truth. You can be invited. You do not have to be stripped by force. You can be touched by grace. That can feel almost unbearable in its beauty. Because if a man has been surviving inside hardness, then grace itself may become the thing that reveals how hungry he has been all along. That is one of the hardest truths of all. Sometimes what reaches a man most deeply is not the wound. It is the glimpse of what healing feels like. Her softness can be that glimpse. Not because she heals him for him, but because she reveals what the defended self has been missing. The possibility of peace. The possibility of closeness without chaos. The possibility of truth without humiliation. The possibility of a feminine presence that does not need to overpower him in order to be powerful. That changes him. Maybe not all at once. Maybe not outwardly at first. But inwardly something has shifted. Because once he has felt softness reach where force could not, he can no longer fully believe the old myth that hardness is the only safe language of transformation. Now he knows there is another language. And that language is often more sacred. This is the deeper truth of Chapter 2. Her softness reaches where force cannot because force often activates his defenses, while softness can move beneath them. Pressure may create reaction, but softness creates contact. Conflict may make him respond, but softness can make him feel. It offers a kind of emotional presence that does not shame, corner, or control him. And because of that, it can touch the deeper masculine self hidden beneath the armor. A single soft, grounded, honest moment may affect him more than years of emotional intensity, because it gives his soul something rare. The experience of being met without having to defend first. And sometimes that is exactly where spiritual awakening begins. Because not everything sacred opens through struggle. Some things only open when grace arrives softly enough that the soul recognizes home before the ego knows how to resist it. Chapter 3. He feels safe enough to drop the mask. One of the deepest reasons her softness becomes his spiritual turning point is this. Around true softness, he may feel safe enough to drop the mask. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Not always in a way anyone else can see. But inwardly, something begins to loosen. And that loosening can change everything. Because many men do not walk through life without a mask. They walk through life because of one. Not necessarily a false mask in the shallow sense. Not some obvious performance of arrogance or emotional coldness. Often the mask looks admirable. It looks like strength, composure, reliability, discipline, calmness, control. The ability to function, endure, provide, handle, and keep moving without letting too much show. From the outside, these qualities may look like maturity. And sometimes they are. But often, mixed in with genuine strength, there is also protection. A man learns early what parts of himself are easier for the world to receive. The stable parts, the useful parts, the measured parts. The parts that do not need much, do not reveal much, do not tremble too openly, do not ask for too much tenderness. Over time, these parts become the face he shows most often. That face becomes the mask. Not because he is fake, because he adapted. An adaptation, when it lasts long enough, can feel like identity. That is why this chapter matters so much. Because her softness does not attack the mask. It makes it less necessary. That is the difference. Pressure often makes a man tighten the mask. Conflict makes him organize it more carefully. Emotional demand makes him protect it. Criticism makes him defend it. Intensity makes him retreat deeper into it. But grounded softness can have a different effect. It can make him feel, perhaps for the first time in a long time, that he does not have to hold himself quite so tightly. That is a holy experience. Because a man may not even realize how much effort it takes to wear the mask until he enters a space where some part of him begins to set it down. Imagine a man who is used to being the composed one, the one who stays calm, the one who does not make things harder, the one who keeps functioning even when something inside hurts, the one who knows how to be present without becoming too emotionally transparent. Then he encounters a woman whose softness is not weak, not chaotic, not manipulative, not needy, not collapsing. She is simply deeply present. She is warm without invading, honest without attacking, tender without losing self-respect. She is emotionally available without trying to force him open before he is ready. Around that kind of softness, something unusual can happen inside him. He exhales. Maybe not visibly. Maybe not consciously. But inwardly he exhales. And that exhale matters more than it looks. Because when a man exhales in the presence of a woman, he is not only relaxing. He may be lowering years of emotional bracing. Bracing against being misunderstood. Bracing against being needed in ways that erase him. Bracing against being judged in his tenderness. Bracing against the pressure to remain the role instead of the human being beneath the role. This is why safety is so powerful. Not because it feels merely nice, but because it changes the nervous system. A man may know how to survive many things. Stress, pressure, loneliness, responsibility, silence, disappointment. But true emotional safety is different. It does not ask him to perform. It does not ask him to defend. It does not ask him to stay impressive. It does not require him to constantly prove his worth through composure. Instead, it quietly says, "You can be here without acting harder than you feel." That kind of message can go very deep, especially for a man whose heart has spent years living behind form. This is why her softness can become such a turning point. It creates the conditions where the mask begins to loosen on its own. Not because she demanded vulnerability, because vulnerability starts feeling possible. There is a major difference between someone trying to get a man to open and someone whose presence makes opening feel safe enough to consider. One creates pressure. The other creates permission. And permission can be far more transformational than pressure ever was. Because many men do not need more force to change. They need one honest experience of not being emotionally cornered. One moment of being met instead of managed. One moment of being seen instead of examined. One moment of being emotionally received instead of unconsciously tested. Her softness can become that moment. And when that happens, the hidden self begins to stir. This is where the chapter deepens. Because what drops with the mask is not only tension. What drops is the gap between the man he shows and the man he is. That gap may be huge. He may be used to showing steadiness while feeling fear. Used to showing control while feeling tenderness. Used to showing clarity while carrying confusion. Used to showing strength while quietly aching for softness himself. The mask helps him function across that gap. But softness begins revealing the cost of it. Because once he feels safe enough to drop the mask even slightly, he may start noticing how exhausting it has been to keep it on. How much energy it takes to stay edited. How much loneliness lives inside, always being the composed one. How much of his emotional life has had no place to rest. That realization can be incredibly moving. And also frightening. Because if the mask begins to loosen, then the hidden self becomes more visible. And visibility is vulnerable. What happens if she sees the quieter sadness? The need? The uncertainty? The tenderness he has kept behind masculine control for years? What happens if he is no longer only the strong one in the room? These questions may rise the moment the mask begins to lower. That is why softness can create both relief and fear at the same time. He feels safer and more exposed. He feels calmer and more emotionally reachable. He feels that he does not have to perform as much. And that realization makes him aware of how much he has always been performing. This is one of the great paradoxes of intimacy. The moment a man feels safe enough to stop acting is often the moment he becomes most aware of what he has been hiding. That awareness can be profound. Because what he has been hiding may not be ugly. It may simply be human. the need to be known, the longing to rest, the grief of always holding it together, the tenderness of a heart that has wanted contact without control, the desire to be met beyond usefulness, beyond role, beyond image. These are not weak things. They are sacred things. But many men have no practice living openly with them. So when softness reaches that layer, it can feel like a spiritual shock. Not because it hurts him, because it reveals him. This is why the line matters so much. Her softness does not demand that he open. It makes opening possible. That is one of the deepest feminine gifts. Not the gift of dragging truth out of him. Not the gift of rescuing him from himself. Not the gift of endlessly waiting for his transformation. The gift of creating a field where he can feel, maybe for one rare moment, that being real would not destroy him. That field is sacred. And even if he does not fully step into it right away, even if he pulls back later, even if he struggles to embody what he felt in that moment, the experience remains. He remembers the calm, the lack of pressure, the way her softness touched something in him he did not know how to name, the way he felt less armored without being made small. Those moments stay, because the soul remembers safety, especially if it has been a long time since it felt it. And once a man has felt safety in a real feminine presence, he can no longer fully believe the old story that hardness is the only way to survive intimacy. Now another possibility exists. The possibility that love does not always come demanding. That truth does not always arrive through pain. That opening might not always mean humiliation. That strength might not require constant tightening. This possibility can become the beginning of spiritual movement in him. Because once the mask drops, even a little, the deeper self begins to breathe. And whatever breathes eventually wants more life. This does not mean he instantly becomes ready. But it does mean the old structure is no longer unquestioned. He has felt another way of being. A way that is less performative, less defended, less lonely, more human, more real. That matters. Because spiritual turning points are not always dramatic. Sometimes they begin in a single moment where a man feels safe enough to stop pretending for one breath longer than usual. And that breath becomes the beginning. This is the deeper truth of Chapter 3. Her softness makes him feel safe enough to drop the mask because it creates emotional permission instead of pressure. Around true softness, he may no longer feel the same need to perform strength, control, and composure every second. His nervous system can soften. His hidden tenderness can stir. The gap between who he shows and who he is begins to narrow, even if only briefly. This does not mean he becomes instantly open. It means opening becomes possible. And once a man feels that possibility in a real way, the mask can never again feel like the whole truth of who he is. Because in the end, what changes him is not that she forced him to reveal himself. It is that her softness created one sacred moment where he no longer needed to hide so completely. Chapter 4. Softness reveals the tenderness he hides. One of the deepest reasons her softness becomes his spiritual turning point is this. It reveals the tenderness he hides. Not the tenderness he shows in socially acceptable ways. Not the tenderness he can perform when the moment is safe enough, brief enough, controlled enough. Not the polished version of softness that still keeps him protected. The real tenderness. The buried one. The tenderness beneath the armor. Beneath the silence. Beneath the masculine restraint. Beneath the version of himself he has learned to offer the world. And that is why softness can affect him so deeply. Because many men do not hide only their pain. They hide their tenderness. This is one of the great unseen realities of the masculine heart. People often assume that what a man protects most is weakness, fear, insecurity, or emotional need. And yes, he may protect all of those things. But very often, what he protects most fiercely is the softer life underneath all of them. The part of him that feels deeply. The part that wants to love cleanly. The part that aches quietly. The part that is moved by beauty, hurt by distance, calmed by gentleness, and hungry for emotional truth in ways he has not fully learned how to live with. That is the part softness touches. And that is the part he may hide most carefully. Because tenderness in a man can feel dangerous. Dangerous not because it is bad. Dangerous because it is exposed. Tenderness is where he is easiest to hurt, where he is easiest to reach, where he is least protected by role and most revealed as human. So if a man has lived in a world that rewarded hardness, self-control, stoicism, usefulness, composure, and emotional restraint, then it makes sense that tenderness would go underground. He may not even realize how deeply he has hidden it. He may simply believe that this is what being strong means, that this is what maturity looks like, that this is how men survive. Then softness enters, and something changes. Because real feminine softness has a way of sensing the tenderness beneath the surface without demanding that it come out on command. It does not say, "Show me your softest parts right now so I can validate them." It does not pressure him into emotional nakedness. It does not shame him for being defended. It simply remains so grounded, so warm, so undistorted that the hidden tenderness in him begins to feel itself in her presence. That is the turning point. Not when he decides to reveal tenderness. When tenderness begins waking up on its own. This is why Chapter 4 matters so much. Because what her softness often reveals is not something she created in him. It is something that was already there. Waiting. Waiting beneath discipline. Waiting beneath the masculine role. Waiting beneath the years of self-management, emotional editing, and silent carrying. Tenderness is rarely absent in the masculine. It is often buried. Buried under what he thought he had to become in order to survive. Buried under disappointments he never fully grieved. Buried under the belief that being too emotionally open would make him weaker, less respected, less safe. Buried under a life that taught him to be dependable before it taught him to be deeply known. So when a woman's softness reaches that layer, it can feel almost unreal. Because now he is not only being liked, not only desired, not only respected. He is being touched in the very place he has tried hardest not to expose. That can be overwhelming. Not because softness is overwhelming in itself, but because the tenderness it awakens may have been hidden for a very long time. Imagine a man who is used to being controlled. Not controlling in an aggressive sense necessarily, but internally controlled, measured, careful, contained. He knows how to stay steady. He knows how to appear calm. He knows how to keep his deeper feelings behind his eyes. He knows how to care without becoming too visibly affected. Then he encounters a woman whose softness is grounded enough that, for one unexpected moment, he feels something shift. He feels the ache behind his own control. The gentleness he rarely shows. The quiet longing to be met in a way that does not demand performance. The hidden wish to be emotionally touched without being exposed to violence, shame, or emotional chaos. That moment can stay with him for years. Why? Because tenderness, once stirred, is hard to forget. It may go back underground. It may get covered again by fear. It may get wrapped once more in silence, hesitation, or withdrawal. But once he has felt it move, something inside him knows. He is not only the armor. He is not only the mask. He is not only the composed self. There is something much softer in him than he has allowed himself to live from. And that realization can become deeply spiritual. Because tenderness is not just emotional sensitivity. It is contact with the soul. The soul is tender by nature. Not weak. Tender. Tender to beauty. Tender to truth. Tender to intimacy. Tender to sincerity. Tender to love that arrives without force. That is why a woman's softness can become a spiritual turning point. It does not only awaken his feelings for her. It awakens his relationship with the hidden tenderness inside himself. And once that tenderness begins to rise, he can no longer fully live in the same unconscious way. He may begin noticing how harsh certain parts of his life feel now. How exhausting constant self-protection is. How lonely emotional control can become. How much tenderness he has denied in the name of being strong. This can create a deep ache. Because tenderness does not rise alone. It often rises with grief. Grief for how long he has hidden. Grief for how much of himself he has kept out of reach. Grief for the ways he has mistaken numbness for stability. grief for the younger self who learned it was safer to hide softness than to trust it. This is why softness can feel more intense than conflict. Conflict may hit the defenses. Softness hits the soul. And when the soul is touched, buried tenderness often rises with it. That tenderness may look like longing, like a quiet sadness he cannot explain, like unusual emotional sensitivity after one small moment, like a softness in his voice he did not expect, like thinking about her not only because he desires her, but because something in him felt deeply met. This is important, because many men do not know how to name tenderness when it awakens. They may call it attraction, missing, confusion, overthinking, emotional overwhelm. But underneath all of that, there may simply be this truth. Something soft in me was touched, and I do not know what to do with that yet. That is often the real experience. Not lack of feeling, lack of language, not lack of depth, lack of familiarity with the depth. Because if a man has spent years organizing himself around not feeling too openly, then tenderness can feel like unfamiliar territory. He may not know how to walk there. He may want to pull back from it. He may feel exposed by it. He may even try to cover it back up with logic, silence, or distance. But still, it has been revealed. That is what matters. Softness reveals the tenderness he hides by making him aware of what exists beneath the defense. It shows him that his heart is softer than his identity allows, that his longing runs deeper than his habits admit, that behind the masculine control is a human being still capable of being touched in a way that feels innocent, sacred, and almost too real to hold. This is also why true softness does not make him less masculine. It makes him more whole. Because wholeness is not hardness without tenderness. Wholeness is strength that is no longer severed from feeling. A truly mature masculine heart is not one that never softens. It is one that can remain rooted when softness appears. That is the deeper invitation her softness brings. Not be less of a man, but stop exiling the tender parts of your manhood. That invitation can be life-changing. Because the part of him that hides tenderness is often also the part that hides devotion, gentleness, reverence, sincerity, and emotional truth. If tenderness never rises, neither do many of the most sacred qualities of mature love. So when her softness awakens tenderness, it may also be awakening the very foundation of the man he is capable of becoming. That is why the moment matters so much. He may not understand it then. He may not respond cleanly. He may not even know how deeply he was touched. But somewhere inside, something has been revealed. I am softer than I thought. I am more reachable than I admitted. I am carrying more tenderness than my defenses allow me to live. And something in her made me feel that. That realization is not small. It can become the beginning of reverence, the beginning of grief, the beginning of awakening, the beginning of wanting a different way of being in love. That is the deeper truth of Chapter 4. Her softness reveals the tenderness he hides. It reaches beneath masculine control and touches the softer emotional life he has kept buried for protection. It awakens longing, gentleness, grief, and the hidden desire to be emotionally met without force. This tenderness may be the very part of him he has protected most fiercely, because it is where he is most human and most vulnerable. But once softness reveals it, he can no longer fully believe that hardness is the whole truth of who he is. And that revelation can become one of the most sacred turning points of all. Because sometimes what changes a man is not being pushed harder. It is finally feeling the softest part of himself rise and realizing it was never dead, only hidden. Chapter 5. Why softness can feel more intense than pain. One of the great paradoxes of the masculine heart is this. Sometimes what shakes him most is not pain. It is softness. Not conflict. Not heartbreak. Not pressure. Not emotional intensity. Not the moments where everything falls apart loudly. But the quiet moment where something gentle reaches him so deeply that he cannot protect himself from feeling it. That is why softness can feel more intense than pain. And until this is understood, so much of his inner experience remains invisible. Because pain is easier to recognize. Pain is obvious. Pain has drama. Pain creates movement. Pain gives the nervous system something familiar to respond to. A man may know exactly what to do with pain. He may shut down, withdraw, go silent, become controlled, become hyperlogical, distract himself, compartmentalize, turn pain into motion, work, distance, or survival. Pain, in a strange way, can fit the old map. It hurts, but it is recognizable. He may not enjoy it, but he knows how to brace against it. Softness is different. Softness does not strike him in the places where he is already defended. It touches the places that wanted something true all along. And that is why it can feel almost unbearable. Because pain often activates protection. Softness awakens longing. That is the deeper truth of this chapter. A man can survive pain while staying armored. But when softness gives him even a glimpse of peace, tenderness, emotional safety, or sacred gentleness, he may suddenly feel how much he has been missing. He may feel what he has not allowed himself to need. He may feel the quiet hunger beneath all the discipline and control. And hunger is often more destabilizing than hurt. Why? Because hurt confirms the old story. The old story says, love is difficult. Closeness is risky. Vulnerability costs. It is safer not to need too much. It is wiser to stay composed. Pain can reinforce those beliefs. But softness challenges them. Softness says, without forcing, there is another way. There is a way of being close that does not destroy you. There is a way of being seen that does not humiliate you. There is a way of being touched that does not demand your collapse. That message can go straight to his soul. And when the soul hears something it has secretly been starving for, the intensity is different. It is not the intensity of danger. It is the intensity of recognition. That is why one soft moment can stay with him longer than years of emotional struggle. A calm voice. A truthful but gentle conversation. A look that sees beneath the performance. A woman whose tenderness does not manipulate. A moment where he feels emotionally safe enough to exhale. These things may look small from the outside, but inside him, they can create enormous movement. Because now he is not only feeling another person. He is feeling the contrast between what is sacred and what he has settled for emotionally. That contrast can ache. A lot. Imagine a man who has spent years inside hardness. Maybe not cruelty. Just hardness. The hardness of always being composed. Always being the one who can handle things. Always keeping his inner world structured. Always turning tenderness into control before anyone can touch it too deeply. Then he encounters real softness. Not weakness. Not neediness. Not emotional flooding. Just grounded gentleness. And for a moment, he feels calmer than usual. More open than usual. More seen than usual. More emotionally touched than he expected. That moment may not feel painful. But after it passes, something else begins. He realizes how rare that feeling was. And that realization can hurt more than ordinary pain. Because now he knows what is possible. Now he knows there is a kind of peace he has not been living with. A kind of contact he has not been allowing. A kind of emotional truth that feels more nourishing than all the old defenses he has relied on. That knowledge creates ache. Not because softness wounded him. Because it revealed what he has been hungry for. This is why softness can feel more intense than pain. Pain may make him tighten. Softness makes him feel what tightening has cost. Pain may activate his defenses. Softness may make him aware of why those defenses exist, and how lonely they have become. Pain may keep him in survival. Softness gives him a glimpse of life beyond survival. And that glimpse can be overwhelming. Especially if he does not yet know how to hold it. This is where the chapter deepens. Because the intensity of softness is not always immediately pleasant for him. It may feel beautiful in the moment, and then destabilizing afterward. Why? Because softness does not only comfort him. It reveals his capacity to receive comfort. It reveals how much of him wants tenderness. How much of him wants rest. How much of him wants to stop performing hardness all the time. And if he has built an identity around not needing those things, then the experience of wanting them can feel very vulnerable. That vulnerability may show up as silence, as withdrawal, as emotional confusion, as thinking about her more than he wants to, as trying to understand why something so gentle affected him so deeply. Because he may not have language for the fact that what touched him most was not passion alone. It was peace. That is a powerful realization. Because many men are far more familiar with intensity than with peace. Intensity is common. Stress is common. Performance is common. Emotional friction is common. But peace that does not come through numbing or distance. Peace that arrives through another person's softness. Peace that does not cost him his dignity. Peace that makes him feel more like himself instead of less. That can be rare. And rare things often become sacred. This is why softness can create a deeper ache than pain. Pain can be survived and explained. Softness can become unforgettable. Because once a man has felt a sacred kind of gentleness, he begins seeing the rest of life differently. He may begin noticing how noisy, harsh, performative, or emotionally shallow so much of his world has been. He may begin noticing how much energy he spends staying armored. He may begin noticing that what he thought was strength may also have been deprivation. That is a painful awakening. Not dramatic pain. Soul pain. The pain of realizing, I have been hungry. I have been tired. I have been more tender than I allowed myself to know. And this moment showed me that. This is also why some men pull back after experiencing deep softness. Not because the softness meant nothing. Because it meant too much. It touched the hidden ache. The hidden need. The hidden longing for a kind of love that does not conquer, but blesses. And if he has not yet built the inner capacity to live inside that kind of blessing, he may become overwhelmed by it. He may think, why did that affect me so much? Why do I keep thinking about her calmness, her gentleness, the way I felt around her? Why does one soft moment feel heavier than all the conflict I have survived before? Because conflict may have met the man he performs. Softness met the man he hides. And the hidden man often feels things more deeply. This is why true feminine softness is never trivial. It has spiritual weight. It can bring a man into contact with the parts of himself that are still innocent, still longing, still capable of reverence, still capable of emotional truth. And once those parts are touched, ordinary pain may seem easier than the ache of having glimpsed something sacred and not knowing how to fully live inside it yet. That is the paradox. Pain may be familiar enough to manage. Softness may be so beautiful that it undoes him. Not because beauty is dangerous, because beauty reveals the soul's starvation. And the soul does not forget being fed. That is the deeper truth of Chapter 5. Softness can feel more intense than pain because pain often activates his defenses, while softness touches what he truly longs for. Pain fits the old map of survival. Softness reveals a different possibility. Peace, tenderness, emotional safety, and sacred contact. It shows him not only what hurts, but what heals. And that can create a deeper ache than pain ever did. Because now he feels the contrast between the life he has been living and the life his soul quietly wants. Sometimes what shakes him most is not suffering. It is the glimpse of something gentle, holy, and real enough that he can no longer pretend he does not hunger for it. Because in the end, pain may wound him. But softness can awaken him to what his heart has been waiting for all along. Chapter 6. Her softness confronts him without attacking him. One of the deepest reasons her softness becomes his spiritual turning point is this. It confronts him without attacking him. And that kind of confrontation can go further into the masculine soul than anger, pressure, blame, or emotional force ever could. Because most men know what to do when they feel attacked. They defend. They withdraw. They explain. They shut down. They become logical. They become silent. They leave the deeper truth untouched while managing the surface of the moment. Attack creates reaction. But softness can create revelation. That is the difference. When a woman confronts a man through force alone, he may hear her words, but often through a shield. Through tension. Through the part of himself that is already preparing for impact. Even if what she says is true, the nervous system may prioritize protection before truth. He becomes busy surviving the energy of the moment, rather than receiving the meaning inside it. But when confrontation comes through grounded softness, something else can happen. He may still feel exposed. He may still feel seen. He may still feel uncomfortable. But he is not being cornered in the same way. Now the discomfort has nowhere obvious to go except inward. And inward is where awakening begins. That is why this chapter matters so much. Because true softness is not avoidance. It is not weakness dressed up as kindness. It is not silence to keep the peace at any cost. It is not emotional passivity. Real softness can tell the truth. It can set a boundary. It can stay present. It can refuse distortion. It can reveal a man to himself without humiliating him in the process. That is incredibly powerful. Because humiliation tends to harden the ego. Softness, when rooted in truth, can bypass the ego and touch the soul. Imagine a woman who is no longer chasing, no longer collapsing, no longer trying to pull answers out of him, but also no longer pretending everything is fine. She speaks clearly, calmly. She names what is real without venom. She does not scream his wounds back at him. She does not beg him to become different in order to soothe her panic. She simply stands in truth. That kind of presence can shake him. Why? Because he feels exposed without being attacked. And exposure without attack is much harder to escape. If she were attacking him, he could focus on her anger. If she were accusing him, he could defend against the accusation. If she were emotionally chaotic, he could tell himself the issue was the chaos. But if she is soft and clear at the same time, then the mirror becomes cleaner. Now he has fewer distractions. Now he cannot simply say, she is overreacting. He cannot reduce the moment to emotional intensity. He cannot hide behind the idea that the discomfort is coming only from her delivery. Now the discomfort is coming from truth itself. That is why softness can confront him more deeply than force. Because softness removes the usual escape routes. It says, without aggression, this is what is real. This is what your distance feels like. This is what your silence creates. This is what I will no longer participate in. This is where I remain true without becoming hard. That kind of truth can pierce him in a way louder emotions cannot. Because something in him recognizes that he is not being dominated. He is being revealed. And revelation is much more spiritually demanding than argument. Many men have spent their lives learning how to survive confrontation from the outside. They may not have learned how to survive confrontation from the inside. But softness often creates inside confrontation. It awakens the part of him that already knows. The part that already feels the gap. The part that already senses where he has been absent. The part that already knows what he is avoiding. The part that already knows the old story is thinning. Her softness does not implant that knowledge. It brings it closer to the surface. This is why her calm truth may disturb him more than her rage. Rage gives him something external to resist. Soft truth leaves him with himself. That can feel like spiritual pressure. Not because she is spiritually doing something to him. Because her energy is no longer distorting what is there. Now he has to feel the contrast between her groundedness and his fragmentation. Between her clarity and his delay. Between her peace and his unrest. Between her ability to stand in truth and his habit of protecting himself from it. This contrast can become almost unbearable in its precision. Because the softness is not shaming him. It is simply making his own state more visible. And visibility is confronting. A man may be able to tolerate his own hardness, as long as nothing shows him another way. But when a woman embodies softness without collapse, love without self-abandonment, truth without violence, he is no longer only encountering a person. He is encountering an alternative way of being. An alternative to armor. An alternative to control. An alternative to emotional distance as identity. That alternative can feel both beautiful and painful. Beautiful, because some deeper part of him recognizes it. Painful, because he may realize how far he has been from it. That is what makes softness such a profound mirror. It does not only say, "This is who I am." It also silently asks, "And who are you becoming in the presence of this?" That is a sacred question. Because now he is no longer only dealing with attraction or chemistry. he is dealing with self-recognition. He may begin to notice his own hardness more clearly, his own emotional absence, his own reflex to hide behind control, his own difficulty receiving tenderness without pulling away, his own fear of being met in a way that asks for truth rather than performance. And all of this may come alive not because she attacked him, but because she didn't. That is the mystery. Softness can become unbearable precisely because it does not violate him. It leaves room. And in that room, his own soul begins speaking louder. He may think about the moment again and again. The calmness in her voice. The lack of demand. The way she stayed true without trying to overpower him. The way her gentleness made his own defenses feel suddenly heavier. Why does that stay with him? Because somewhere inside, he knows he was not only hearing her. He was hearing himself more clearly in her presence. This is why softness can become a turning point. It reveals him without trying to destroy him. And many men have never experienced that kind of confrontation before. They may have experienced disappointment, criticism, pressure, punishment, withdrawal. But a confrontation that remains soft, truthful, rooted, and self-honoring? That is rare. And rare things often become spiritually significant. Because when a man is confronted without attack, he has a chance to remain present. He may still struggle, still fear, still withdraw for a time. But the moment stays different in his memory. Why? Because he cannot reduce it to emotional chaos. He cannot dismiss it as mere drama. He cannot make her the problem as easily. The truth remains standing there, quiet and clear. And that quiet clarity can haunt him in the holiest way. Not as torment. As invitation. Invitation to stop hiding behind hardness. Invitation to stop confusing self-protection with wholeness. Invitation to become honest about what he feels and what he has been doing with those feelings. This is what softness does at its deepest level. It invites without forcing. But invitation can still be confronting. In fact, sometimes invitation is more confronting than force because it reveals freedom. It reveals that he is not being trapped. He is being offered a chance to meet truth. And if he turns away, he feels more clearly that the turning away is his. That is a powerful spiritual moment. Because now he can no longer fully blame the pressure of the outside world. He can no longer hide behind being cornered. He can no longer say he was not given room. He was given room. And the room itself became the mirror. That is the deeper truth of chapter 6. Her softness confronts him without attacking him. It does not shame, force, or overpower his defenses. Instead, it creates a clear and grounded field where truth can be felt without emotional violence. This makes his own hardness, fear, delay, and inner fragmentation more visible to him. He is exposed without being humiliated. And that exposure often reaches deeper than force ever could. Her calm truth may disturb him more than her anger because it leaves him with fewer escape routes and more contact with his own soul. And sometimes that kind of confrontation becomes the very moment his real awakening begins. Because in the end, the soul does not always turn through pressure. Sometimes it turns when it is met so gently that it can no longer justify staying hidden in the same way. Chapter 7. He begins to feel the cost of his defenses. One of the deepest things her softness does is this. It makes him feel the cost of his defenses. Not as a theory. Not as a spiritual idea. Not as something he can nod at and then forget. He feels it. And that feeling can become a turning point. Because before softness touches him, many of his defenses may still feel useful, necessary, even wise. His distance may feel like control. His silence may feel like protection. His emotional restraint may feel like maturity. His carefulness may feel like strength. His ability to stay composed may feel like proof that he is handling life well. And maybe in some ways he is. But softness changes the measure. That is what makes it so powerful. Because once a man experiences real feminine softness, not weakness, not overgiving, not emotional collapse, but grounded softness, he begins to sense a contrast. A contrast between how he has been living and what becomes possible in the presence of something true, warm, and undistorted. And contrast is what reveals cost. Before contrast, a man may live inside his defenses without questioning them too much. He may simply think, this is who I am. This is how I function. This is how I protect my peace. This is how I survive love. But once softness reaches him, he begins to realize that what he called peace may also have been distance. What he called control may also have been fear. What he called strength may also have been emotional isolation. That realization can be painful, because defenses do not only protect, they also deprive. This is one of the hardest truths of the masculine heart. A defense is rarely just a wall against pain. It is also often a wall against tenderness, against rest, against intimacy, against being deeply known, against the kind of emotional nourishment that cannot enter a life still organized around constant self-protection. That is why softness can become such a spiritual turning point. It shows him what his defenses have been costing him. Maybe they kept him safe, but they also kept him alone. Maybe they preserved his image, but they also kept him partially unseen. Maybe they helped him stay in control, but they also kept him from fully receiving the peace he secretly longs for. That is the ache. And often, he does not feel that ache clearly until softness enters. Imagine a man who has spent years living from control. He knows how to manage his emotions. He knows how to stay measured. He knows how to reveal just enough to remain close without becoming vulnerable in ways that frighten him. He knows how to maintain the masculine role well enough that most people assume he is fine, strong, grounded, and unaffected. Then he experiences a woman whose softness is steady enough to make him feel calm. Not excited only. Calm. Not stimulated only. Met. And in that meeting, something subtle but huge happens. He realizes how tired he is. Tired of holding himself together in the old way. Tired of bracing. Tired of editing. Tired of always being the composed one. Tired of needing distance in order to feel safe. That tiredness may have always been there, but now softness gives it language. That is why he begins to feel the cost of his defenses. Because now he knows there is another way to exist. Another way to be in contact. Another way to be masculine. Another way to be strong without always being armored. And once he knows that, the old way starts feeling heavier. This is often how awakening begins. Not with dramatic revelation. With heaviness. A man notices that what once felt natural now feels effortful. What once felt safe now feels lonely. What once felt like power now feels tiring. What once helped him survive now feels too small for what his soul has touched. This is the hidden pain softness reveals. It does not just show him beauty. It shows him what he had to become in order to live without that beauty. And that can bring grief. Grief for the years spent defended. Grief for the tenderness he hid. Grief for how much emotional life he kept outside of reach. Grief for the younger self who learned that softness was dangerous, so he turned himself toward hardness instead. This is why softness can be more confronting than pain. Pain might confirm his defenses. Softness questions them. Pain says, see, this is why you need the armor. Softness says, what if the armor is also the reason you cannot fully live? That question can shake a man. Because if the armor is no longer only protection, then what is it? A habit. A survival structure. An identity built in response to old pain. A shield that once mattered, but now also costs him access to truth. This is where the spiritual layer deepens. A man begins to realize that his defenses are not neutral. They shape his whole experience of intimacy. They shape how much love he can receive, how much truth he can tolerate, how much tenderness he can stay present with before turning away. And if softness has shown him even one sacred glimpse of life beyond those defenses, then the defenses themselves start becoming more visible. He may notice how quickly he shuts down when something feels too real. How often he uses silence to regain control. How much effort it takes to remain unreadable. How often he withdraws from the very thing that nourishes him because nourishment itself feels unfamiliar. These are not small realizations. They are revelations of cost. Because every defense has a price. The price of emotional control may be emotional loneliness. The price of constant composure may be exhaustion. The price of never needing too much may be never feeling fully held. The price of staying hidden may be that no one can fully love the self beneath the performance. And once a man feels those prices in the presence of softness, he can no longer fully worship the old defenses in the same way. That is what changes him. Not because softness breaks him. Because softness makes the old life harder to justify. He may still use the defenses for a while. Still retreat into them. Still cling to them when he feels overwhelmed. But inwardly something has shifted. Now he knows what they cost. Now he knows that control is not the same as peace. Now he knows that self-protection is not the same as wholeness. Now he knows that staying guarded may keep him safe from some pain, but it also keeps him far from some grace. That grace matters. Because what softness often gives him is not just a relationship experience. It gives him a glimpse of another self. A self that does not need to be so defended. A self that can stay present with tenderness. A self that can remain masculine without being emotionally exiled from his own heart. A self that can receive love without turning it into a threat. This glimpse can create longing. And longing, in this case, is sacred. Because he is not just longing for her. He is longing for the version of himself he felt possible in her softness. That is why the cost of his defenses becomes so emotionally intense. He realizes he has not only been protecting himself from hurt, he has also been protecting himself from becoming. Becoming softer without becoming weak. Becoming more open without becoming unsafe. Becoming more honest without losing dignity. Becoming more whole. That is a spiritual turning point. Because once a man sees that his defenses are not only saving him but also limiting him, the old identity begins to crack. He may not know yet what to do about it. He may feel conflicted, restless, quiet, emotionally stirred in ways he cannot explain. But the stirring is real. And beneath it is this truth. I am tired of living at a distance from what my soul actually wants. That truth changes everything. Because spiritual awakening often begins when the old protections become more painful than the vulnerability they were built to avoid. Softness can create that threshold. It can make him feel the burden of hardness, the strain of always being in control, the ache of always bracing, the loneliness of never fully letting the deeper self live in the open. And once he feels that ache clearly enough, he can never entirely return to innocence. He can still resist. Still retreat. Still struggle. But some part of him now knows. The defenses cost too much. That is the deeper truth of Chapter 7. Her softness makes him feel the cost of his defenses. It reveals that what once looked like strength may also be loneliness. That what once felt like control may also be exhaustion. And that what once protected him may now be separating him from the tenderness, truth, and peace he most deeply needs. Softness does not shame his armor. It simply shows him what life feels like when the armor is not running everything. And once he has felt that contrast, the old defenses become heavier, more visible, and harder to call freedom. That is why her softness can become his spiritual turning point. Because it awakens not only longing for her, but grief for the ways he has kept himself from fully living. And sometimes that grief is the beginning of real change. Because the moment a man starts feeling the cost of his defenses is often the moment his soul begins asking for something more honest than survival. Chapter 8. Why this becomes a spiritual turning point. There is a difference between being emotionally affected by someone and being spiritually changed by them. That difference is what Chapter 8 is really about. Because when her softness reaches him deeply enough, something more than attraction begins happening. Something more than comfort, more than chemistry, more than emotional tenderness. He begins to experience a spiritual turning point. Not always dramatically. Not always in a way he can explain right away. But inwardly, something starts turning. That is the key word here. Turning. A turning away from the old self. A turning toward a deeper truth. A turning from defense into awareness. A turning from survival into the possibility of wholeness. That is why her softness matters so much. Because her softness does not only make him feel loved. It makes him feel himself. And for many men, that is far more life-changing than people realize. A man can live for years inside roles that appear strong enough to carry him through life. He can be competent, disciplined, controlled, reliable, quietly burdened, privately lonely, emotionally defended. He can know how to function in the world and still remain far from his own soul. This is more common than most people admit. A man may know how to perform masculinity very well without actually feeling deeply at home inside himself. He may know how to stay steady in crisis, how to survive disappointment, how to avoid emotional exposure, how to keep moving. But the version of him that survives is not always the version of him that is most alive. That is why softness can become a turning point, because it gives him a glimpse of the self beneath survival. A self that is more tender than he thought, more longing than he admitted, more reachable than he wanted to believe, more spiritually hungry than his old life allowed him to know. This is where things stop being merely relational. Now the connection is no longer just about her. It becomes about the kind of man he is in the presence of truth. That is what makes the shift spiritual. A spiritual turning point is not always a mystical vision or an obvious awakening moment. Often it is simply the moment when the old way of being no longer fits as comfortably as before. The moment when something deeper becomes visible enough that you can no longer fully return to unconsciousness. The moment when a new possibility enters your life so clearly that your old identity begins feeling too small. That is what her softness can do. It makes his old identity feel too small. Not because it humiliates him, because it reveals more. More tenderness, more peace, more depth, more emotional truth, more spiritual possibility than the defended self knows how to carry. That revelation can be beautiful and devastating, because once a man feels a deeper possibility in himself, he also begins feeling the distance between who he has been and who he could become. He begins noticing how much of his life has been organized around control, restraint, distance, and self-protection. He begins noticing how much effort it takes to stay armored. He begins noticing that what once felt like safety may also have been separation. That is the turning point. It is not just, I feel something for her. It is, I am not the same man after this kind of contact. That can be very hard to hold, because spiritual turning points rarely arrive with instructions. He may not know what to do next. He may only know that something in him has shifted. He may feel quieter, more reflective, more emotionally aware, more dissatisfied with surface-level connection, more aware of how lonely the old form of masculinity can become when it is cut off from tenderness. These are signs of spiritual movement, not because he is suddenly perfect, but because his soul has been touched in a place his old identity cannot fully explain away. This is why her softness does not merely create emotional impact. It creates self-recognition. That may be the most important line in this chapter. Her softness becomes his spiritual turning point because it helps him recognize himself in a way he has not before. Not the role, not the performance, not the masculine image. The self underneath. The self that still wants truth, still wants peace, still wants love without force, still wants to be more than a man who survives by staying guarded. That self-recognition is sacred because once it happens, he cannot entirely go back. He may try. He may return to habits, return to silence, return to distance, return to the familiar ways of organizing his emotions. But something in him now knows there is more available. And once a man knows there is more available, the old life begins losing some of its authority. That is often how awakening begins. Not with immediate transcendence. With dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction with the old defenses. The old hardness. The old emotional hiding. The old story that control is the same thing as peace. This dissatisfaction can be deeply uncomfortable, because it means he is no longer fully asleep. He starts noticing things. How much he edits himself. How much he fears being reached too deeply. How often he pulls back from what nourishes him. How much of his masculinity has been built around not needing, not softening, not revealing. These realizations may not be spoken aloud, but they work on him. Quietly. Steadily. like a turning wheel inside the soul. That is why spiritual turning points often look subtle from the outside. No one may see the exact moment. No one may know how much changed. But inwardly the axis shifts. And once the axis shifts, life begins organizing differently. He may begin wanting different things, valuing different kinds of connection, feeling less satisfied by shallowness, being more affected by honesty, being less able to tolerate emotional falseness, being more aware of what the soul wants than what the ego can comfortably maintain. This is all part of the turning. And often, it begins not because she demanded transformation, but because her softness revealed what transformation would feel like. That is why softness can become more spiritually significant than pain. Pain may show him what hurts. Softness shows him what is possible. And possibility can be more destabilizing than pain. Because pain confirms the old world. Possibility threatens it. A man may know how to survive suffering. He may not know how to survive beauty that asks him to become more true. That is what her softness can do. It shows him a form of love that does not demand performance. A form of intimacy that does not require violence. A form of femininity that does not control, collapse, or harden to be powerful. And in the presence of that, something in him may begin asking deeper questions. Who am I beneath the armor? What kind of man do I become when truth is soft instead of harsh? What have I been protecting myself from, pain, or also grace? Why does this gentleness affect me more than all the intensity one thought mattered most? What if my deepest turning point is not being broken open by loss, but quietly awakened by softness? Those are soul questions. And when a man starts living with soul questions, he has already entered a different stage of life. This is also why softness can feel holy. Not because it is sentimental, but because it invites reverence. Reverence for what is tender, for what is real, for what does not have to dominate to be powerful, for what reaches the soul by revealing rather than overpowering. That kind of reverence changes a man. It may not change him overnight, but it changes his inner standard. He begins to know, in some quiet place, that his life cannot remain exactly as it was after this kind of contact. That the defended self is no longer enough. That the old performance is too small. That the soul wants a masculinity capable of truth, tenderness, and spiritual responsibility. That is the real turning point. Not merely being touched. Being turned. Turned toward wholeness. Toward honesty. Toward a different kind of strength. Toward the man he could become if he no longer built his life around hiding from the softer truths inside himself. This is the deeper truth of Chapter 8. Her softness becomes a spiritual turning point because it awakens more than feeling. It awakens self-recognition, dissatisfaction with false strength, awareness of the soul's deeper hunger, and the possibility of becoming a more truthful man. It reveals the gap between who he has been and who he could be. It shows him that there is another way to love, another way to be close, another way to be masculine without exiling tenderness. And once that possibility enters him deeply enough, his inner axis begins to turn. He may resist it, fear it, struggle with it, or move through it quietly. But he cannot fully go back to the old unconsciousness. Something in him has already changed direction. Because in the end, a spiritual turning point is not always the moment life explodes. Sometimes it is the moment the soul quietly says, "There is more of you here than the life you have been living." And once a man hears that deeply enough, even through the gentlest feminine softness, the turning has already begun. Chapter 9. The turning point is not always obvious at first. One of the most important truths about a spiritual turning point is this. It does not always look dramatic when it begins. Sometimes there is no confession, no sudden breakthrough, no immediate change in behavior, no obvious outer sign that something profound has just shifted inside him. Sometimes the turning point is almost invisible at first. And that is exactly why so many people miss it. They expect transformation to look loud. They expect awakening to look clear. They expect that if a man has been deeply touched, he should instantly know what to say, what to do, what to choose, and how to embody it. But that is rarely how real inner change begins. Because the soul often turns before the outer life catches up. That is the deeper truth of this chapter. When her softness becomes his spiritual turning point, it may first show up in quiet ways. Increased silence, unexpected tenderness, inner conflict, restlessness, a strange emotional heaviness, a delayed realization that one soft, honest, grounded connection affected him far more than he wanted to admit. This matters deeply, because people often assume that if he goes quiet, nothing happened. But sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes he goes quiet because too much happened. Not too much externally, too much internally. Her softness may have reached a place in him that was not prepared to be reached so cleanly. It may have touched the tenderness beneath the armor, the longing beneath the control, the hidden self beneath the role. And once that hidden self begins to stir, the outer man may not know how to reorganize quickly around what he now feels. That is why the turning point is not always obvious. Because what changes first is often not his behavior. It is his interior. Before this moment, he may have been able to move through life and connection with a certain inner structure. He knows how to stay composed. He knows how to remain functional. He knows how to keep tenderness compartmentalized. He knows how to receive feeling without fully surrendering to what the feeling means. Then softness reaches him. Now something inside that structure begins to shift. He may start thinking differently, feeling differently, remembering differently, valuing certain moments more than he expected, becoming emotionally affected by quiet things he would have once dismissed. This is often how a real turning point begins. Not with outward certainty, with inward movement. And inward movement can look messy. He may become more reflective, but not yet more expressive. He may feel more tenderness, but also more fear. He may sense the sacredness of what happened, but not yet know how to live from that recognition. He may feel a pull toward truth while another part of him still clings to old defenses. That creates inner conflict. And inner conflict is often one of the first signs that the old self is no longer fully comfortable. A man may begin experiencing a strange contradiction. He feels calmer in memory, but more restless in the present. He feels drawn toward the softness he experienced, but also afraid of how much it affected him. He feels gratitude, grief, longing, and hesitation all at once. That is not failure. That is often the beginning of deeper awakening. Because awakening is not always a smooth rising into light. Sometimes it is the painful realization that the old identity cannot fully digest what the soul has already recognized. That gap between recognition and embodiment can create silence. Not empty silence. Pregnant silence. A silence filled with unfinished understanding. A silence where he is trying to make sense of why one woman's softness, one grounded presence, one honest and gentle encounter has followed him more deeply than years of louder experiences ever did. He may ask himself questions he cannot easily answer. Why did that affect me so much? Why do I keep remembering the way I felt around her? Why does her gentleness stay with me more than conflict ever did? Why do I feel softer and more unsettled at the same time? Those are not small questions. They are soul questions. And soul questions often begin before there are soul answers. That is why the turning point may first look like delay. Not because the experience was shallow. Because it was deep enough to unsettle him beyond his current emotional language. Many men have been trained to understand action, pressure, performance, and control more easily than tenderness, reverence, and emotional safety. So when something soft becomes spiritually significant, he may not have a ready-made framework for it. He may only know that something in him is no longer untouched, that can create emotional tenderness in strange forms. He may become quieter with others, more inward, more sensitive to tone, memory, or absence. He may feel a subtle grief without knowing exactly what he is grieving. He may start noticing how shallow other interactions feel by comparison. These are often invisible signs of a turning point. Not because he is transformed already, because transformation has begun working underneath the surface. This is also why delayed realization is so common. The moment itself may be small. A conversation, a look, a calm exchange. A brief period where he felt seen without pressure and safe without losing dignity. At the time, he may simply experience it as different. Only later does he realize it was sacred. Only later does he realize it reached places in him that nothing else had reached. Only later does he begin to understand that what moved him was not simply attraction, but self-recognition. That delayed realization can be very powerful. Because once he realizes what happened, he may also realize how long he has lived without that kind of contact. How long he has gone without softness that did not weaken him, tenderness that did not control him, truth that did not humiliate him. That realization can deepen the turning point after the fact. This is why awakening often begins quietly before it becomes visible. The soul recognizes first. The heart softens next. The ego resists. The nervous system trembles. The outer life takes time. And in that in-between place, he may look confusing from the outside. He may not know how to speak yet. He may not know how to move yet. He may only know that the old life feels slightly different now. That difference matters. Because spiritual turning points are often not announced by dramatic behavior. They are marked by the fact that something old no longer fits as comfortably as before. The hardness feels heavier. The defenses feel more visible. The distance feels less noble. The old ways of being a man feel less complete. That is how the turning begins maturing. Not through instant perfection. Through inner discomfort with what once felt normal. He may still resist. Still retreat. Still wobble between the old self and the emerging one. But if the turning point is real, he cannot fully return to unconsciousness in the same way. He may try to distract himself. Try to call it nothing. Try to reduce it to chemistry, timing, or mood. But something deeper in him knows. Knows he was touched. Knows he felt another possibility. Knows he cannot entirely forget the glimpse of who he was in that softness. And sometimes that knowing is enough to begin changing everything, even before anyone else can see it. That is the deeper truth of Chapter 9. His spiritual turning point is not always obvious at first because real awakening often begins inwardly, quietly, and imperfectly. Her softness may first create silence, inner conflict, tenderness, restlessness, or delayed realization rather than immediate outer clarity. He may not know how to express what changed, but he begins feeling that the old self no longer fits in the same way. The soul has recognized something, the heart has softened around it, and the defenses are no longer as invisible as before. That is how many sacred turning points begin, not with dramatic proof, but with an inner shift that quietly refuses to disappear. Because in the end, the most powerful transformations are not always the loudest when they start. Sometimes they begin as one soft moment the soul cannot stop remembering. And that is how a man begins to turn. Chapter 10. What her softness is really doing. In the end, her softness does not become his spiritual turning point because it is dramatic. It becomes his turning point because it is true. That is the deepest truth beneath everything we have explored. Her softness does not force him. It does not chase him. It does not overpower him. It does not argue him into awakening. It does not shame him into transformation. It reveals him. And that is why it can change everything. Because when a man is used to pressure, conflict, performance, emotional control, and the constant need to hold himself together, softness can reach him in a completely different way. It does not meet the armored self and demand that he fight harder. It slips beneath the armor and touches the life underneath it, the tenderness, the longing, the grief, the hidden need for rest, the quiet hunger to be met without being conquered. That is what her softness is really doing. It is not making him weak. It is making him honest. Honest about how tired he is. Honest about how much effort the mask takes. Honest about how much tenderness lives beneath the masculine control. Honest about how deeply he wants peace, even if he has spent years pretending not to need it. Honest about the fact that something in him has been waiting for a love that does not arrive as force. And once that honesty begins, the old life starts changing. That is why her softness becomes spiritual. Because it does not only touch his emotions. It touches his self-concept. It shows him that he is more than the role he has learned to play. More than the controlled one, the silent one, the strong one, the one who handles everything and reveals very little. It shows him that beneath that role is a man with a soul that still responds to gentleness, still aches for truth, still softens in the presence of something sacred. That realization is powerful. Because once a man feels that, he can no longer fully believe the old story that hardness is the only safe way to be strong. He may still return to old habits, still resist, still wobble, still move through silence and inner conflict. But something in him now knows another way exists. A softer way, a truer way, a more whole way. That is why her softness becomes a turning point and not just a beautiful moment. A beautiful moment can be remembered. A turning point reorients. It changes what feels meaningful. It changes what feels empty. It changes what he can tolerate. It changes what he secretly begins longing to become. Now he may start noticing how heavy his defenses feel, how lonely performance feels, how exhausting constant self-protection is, how much of his life has been built around surviving intimacy rather than living inside it. This is why softness can feel so intense. Not because it wounds him, because it reveals the wound between who he has been and who he could become. That gap can ache. He may feel grief for how long he has hidden. He may feel regret for how many moments he stayed defended. He may feel reverence for what her softness showed him about himself. He may feel fear because once the soul has been touched, change becomes harder to postpone without feeling the cost. And that is the true spiritual turning point. It is not the moment he becomes perfect. It is the moment he can no longer stay fully asleep. Her softness wakes up self-recognition. It says without words, "You are more tender than you admitted. You are more reachable than you believed. You are more hungry for peace than your defenses allowed you to know. There is more of you here than the life you have been living." That message can echo in him long after the moment ends. This is why softness often stays with him more than pain. Pain may bruise the ego. Softness reaches the soul. Pain may create reaction. Softness creates remembrance. Remembrance of who he is beneath survival. Remembrance of what kind of love feels sacred. Remembrance of the man he could become if he stopped organizing his life around fear. That is what her softness is really doing. It is not trying to save him. It is showing him what grace feels like. And grace is powerful because it cannot be argued with in the same way force can. He may resist it, delay it, fear it, but once he has felt it, he cannot fully erase the imprint. He cannot fully go back to the belief that control is enough. Somewhere inside, the deeper self has already turned. That is why this matters so much for the divine masculine journey. Because many men are not transformed only by pain, consequences, or collapse. Some are transformed by the moment they realize that truth can arrive gently and still undo everything false. That is what softness does. It undoes what is false without violence. It loosens the mask without humiliation. It reveals the hidden heart without forcing exposure. It confronts the defenses without becoming another threat. It invites the soul forward without dragging it into the light. An invitation, when it is real, can be one of the most spiritually demanding things of all. Because once he has been invited into a deeper self, he must decide whether he will keep living as the old man or begin becoming the truer one. That decision may take time. It may move through silence, conflict, tenderness, regret, and delayed realization. But the turning has already begun. So if this message found you today, remember this. Real softness is never small. It does not need to shout to be powerful. It does not need to dominate to change someone. It does not need to lose itself in order to love deeply. Your softness is not weak because it is gentle. Your softness is sacred when it is rooted in truth. And if it has touched him deeply, even if the process looks quiet, even if it looks messy, even if the turning is not obvious yet, something real has already happened. Because the soul does not forget what made it feel safe enough to remember itself. If this resonated with you, write in the comments. What do you think her softness awakens most deeply in him? Peace, longing, tenderness, or truth? And if you want more videos on divine feminine energy, divine masculine awakening, sacred love, healing, and soul connection, subscribe and join me for the next one.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.